But you've possibly seen television programs on this, but we've certainly looked at it in more detail inside physics itself. The Japanese culture seems to have quite a lot of difficulty with fostering individual work. And it's ironic, as some of the recent television programs have pointed out, that their attempts to foster originality go right back to the original idea of working in regimented teams. So they have shots of people in nice buildings with nice pastel shade walls, with nice music in the background, all encouraging creativity. And the camera pans to the wall where it has shots, mug shots of all the people involved with their numbers in front of them. So this is not the sort of thing which is encouraged in the West. But conversely, some people who admire the Japanese, and they are to be admired in many ways, I would point out that the extreme individualism, as they see it, of the West has its problems as well. And it's not just in the case of authoritarian regimes that physics people have been prominent. Richard Feynman, for instance, who died a couple of years ago, the American physicist, was instrumental in pointing out that the problems of the space shuttle in America, the one that exploded, really arose because of political management of NASA rather than the mistakes made with things called O-rings, which are rubber rings, which they used at the wrong temperature, and this caused this disaster. And the management there tried to pin this on the unfortunate people who'd in fact been ordered to put such O-rings in position. But of course, I wouldn't make a virtue of this, because there are many physicists who display no such qualities. And again, dwelling on physics for a bit longer, the plea I'd like to make here is that it's seen more as a human activity, naturally because of its awful record as producing the bomb and the awful record of the application of other scientific subjects, biology and chemistry, the connection with biological warfare and chemical warfare. It is understandable in many ways that many young people, especially in England, have turned away from science. But in fact, here again you've got the problem of the observer and the experiment. Lots of polls and attempts to work out why this is so show the whole thing is so complex that it's a much bigger question than people being turned off science because of its bad image. It's in the culture, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, in England especially. I don't include Scotland in this, or Wales, or the Celtic countries in general, where there's a completely different tradition. I couldn't really say much about science in those countries. I could about Scotland, but not the other ones, because I don't know much about them. But I certainly know a fair amount, would claim to know a fair amount about the situation in England, having worked there a very long time, and seen the general gradation of things, where you equate certain universities with the top league and other universities with the second league, and the poor old polytechnics with the third or fourth league. So you've got an interesting situation at the moment where you've essentially had a populist government in England which has tried to smack the universities into line, in some cases with disastrous results, and tried to favour the polytechnics. But in my view, this is largely connected with social attitudes. And it's not a good thing, to repeat myself, to regard certain subjects as useful and others as useless. The problem is basically as regards science, in that the generally accepted view in the Anglo-Saxon world, by this I mean the USA, and in real terms most of the British Isles and Ireland, because essentially the English culture is by definition the dominant culture here. Scientists are either regarded in this culture as evil geniuses. There's no problem in understanding where this has arisen, or as naive saints. Possibly some people are in the exclusive club here who watch Sharkey and George at 8 o'clock on Channel 4 on a Sunday morning. Having young kids, I watch it avidly every Sunday. And this perfectly illustrates what I mean. There's a character in this who is actually an octopus who is known as Dr. Jelly, and he personifies the evil scientist. At the other extreme, you had in the now defunct Doctor Who series, the quite world-wise, not so naive Doctor Who. And these are the two extremes of the views of scientists. But in fact, they're nothing like this. They're just ordinary people with ordinary feelings and ordinary emotions. So that's my fairly tenuous connection with Manx. To summarize this, I see the whole thing as human cultural activity, and what's happened to science is that it's been taken out of this context in the rush towards specialization. This is a well-worn theme. It's by no means original. I'm just repeating what many other people have said. And somehow or another, we need to integrate all of these subjects again, somehow or another, because the immediate reaction is to label. I haven't been in such a fortunate position, and I'm certainly embarrassed by the very glowing tributes I got from Mr. Davis there, but anyone in the Anglo-Saxon world who can speak a couple of languages, I wouldn't claim 8 by the way, and who can do maths and science and so on, is immediately labelled as polymath. But if I think of the conferences I've been at, for instance, if I think of the very down-to-earth subject I used to work on, which was on bearings, fairly exotic bearings, okay, but on bearings, there was a Romanian engineer there who quite happily, obviously spoke Romanian. A Russian asked him a question, he answered him in Russian. A French person asked a question, he answered him in French. Gave the lecture in English. He went to work in the USA, and he was regarded as absolutely standard in Romania. He was not regarded as a freak. And I think it's because we live in a monolingual society here that you have these attitudes. And the need certainly for Manx is to realize its great potential as a cultural activity. And to finish off on this theme, it's a marvelous development, a development which I would never have imagined in a million years, thinking of the situation 40 years ago, that the Manx government is willing to finance the post of Manx language officer and the appointment of 2 peripatetic teachers following this. This alone won't transform the situation. And I'm slightly irritated by the headline in the Courier today saying something like attempt to revive dying language. Well, a lot of people would regard it as dead. This is sort of argument about whether it's dead or not is largely a waste of time. We have people speaking various forms of Manx. You can argue about whether it's correct or not. Nevertheless, there are people alive who can communicate lots of emotions, lots of their activities through Manx, and all sorts of things through Manx. They have lots of pleasant cultural exchanges through Manx, and not so pleasant cultural exchanges through Manx. And it is a microcosm of a living world which can fairly easily be extended. So we shouldn't be pessimistic about this. And this appointment will not bring miracles. An appointment of the 2 teachers will not bring miracles, but it's a huge advance on what we had before. So long as people can understand that it is a cultural activity which is necessary for the traditional Manx people to exorcise all those ghosts walking around the place, you can regard it in its lowest terms as an exercise, if I can say it, an exercise in exorcism. And at the very lowest level, it will actually enable people to make surprisingly large number of interesting contacts outside the island. Because the very interesting thing that I saw when I went back to Liverpool And I was unwisely thinking that I would initially keep this job a secret, but when I appeared with my family on television, I knew there wasn't much hope of this. So that the people in Liverpool were very surprised about this and very quickly said, and this was nothing to do with me personally, this is the interesting thing, whereas a few years ago they would have said, yes, you're very lucky to get back to the Isle of Man, but we can't for the life of us understand what you're doing this for. What possible use can Manx be? But again, you've got to make allowances for the personal politeness aspect. People, the skeptics would say, oh, they're only saying that because they know you or they know of this. They're being nice. But I don't think so. Because a lot of these people don't specialize in being nice, as I can prove quite quickly. And they've said, without exception, it's a marvelous thing that the Isle of Man wants to foster that language. And this is a feature, actually, which possibly people on the island, I'm not being patronizing here because I haven't lived here, I just don't know, are not aware of. And other people have commented on this. People who are working, teaching Irish in England have commented on this remarkable switch around inside England itself. You're not getting people saying in droves, oh, these languages must be revived, must be given more money and so on. They're saying it's a great thing that they are being cultivated. And I'd like to end by saying that the mission here that we've got really is to cultivate that interest among the young people here especially, while simultaneously building up the fluency of people here who speak Manx. Again, I'm not being patronizing, I hope I'm not offending anyone in saying this. And the crying need, and this is a sort of an incredible task, but we can address ourselves to it to a limited extent, in creating a literature, a more wide literature in Manx, both by translations, even if we have to resort to samizdat, that is sending duplicated manuscripts around the place if we can't afford to get it published, and certainly by original writing. So I'll let it rest there, and if you've got any questions or observations, I'd be glad to answer them. Thanks very much. So is everyone struck dumb? You don't have to ask questions or make observations. We can end now if you like.
Can I just make a comment that many people believe that the thing of the future will be one universal language, of which the best features of all the existing languages will be incorporated. And for that reason, these languages should be preserved.
How do I answer that now? Help, please. It's would that be too flippant? It's you've got to. It sounds like being a physicist here. You've got to define best, because subjectivity comes into this straight away, and the thing about any language. This is what I meant possibly about the difficulties of claiming to measure things. The problem with languages is that they're so emotional, you see. And I'm not saying that we're carried away with passion completely, but certain people like the sounds of certain languages, and they're attracted to various other languages apart from their first language. And it's difficult to pin this down. For instance, if you look at the book, the famous classic, an attempt to bring, again without being facetious, culture to the masses, there were books like Mathematics for the Million and The Loom of Language. Well, The Loom of Language has got a chapter on the Celtic languages, and the heading for this is The Decay of Language, or Disease of Language, sorry. And the disease of language, I'm not sure what he defined this as, possibly the awful fact that the Celtic languages have got mutations, which are associated certainly with with English speakers and possibly other speakers as decadence. You know, it's a sort of subjective decision. I don't know whether this is true or not. They certainly bring out all sorts of unfortunate things, like Scousers being discriminated against for saying Bach instead of back, and this sort of thing. So it would be difficult to define what you meant by the best features. I've actually been interested in Esperanto at one stage, but possibly because I'm such a keen, not to say fanatical, Manx speaker or attempted Manx speaker, I find it's not very satisfying, you see. There's probably a lot more literature in Esperanto than there is in Manx in many ways, but it hasn't got any sort of resonance for me. That's the problem, I think. You've also got the problem, which is duplicated with computer languages, that if you go into computing at all, somebody is always going to produce the definitive computing language. They produce, well, if you take the computing language called Fortran, which a lot of people are now trying to get rid of, there's all sorts of dialects of this grown up. There's Fortran for this and Fortran for that. And this was supposed to be, at one stage, the universal scientific computing language. And the people are saying, oh, that's old hat now. You've got to learn C, the programming language. So it's a sort of similar thing to the human situation. So it's very difficult to answer the question, because you've got to define best. Don't know how you define that. Have you got any views on what you mean by best?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
You mentioned one time you tried to learn Esperanto. Well,
Yeah.
Esperanto wasn't allowed to change or develop or expand. But as I see it, a universal language will come which will be allowed to expand and develop. And in the future, through worldwide education, the human mind will develop, and people's vocal range will develop, and modes will develop, and vocabulary will develop, and gradually all the best features of all the languages will be incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
Quite hard to imagine.
Yeah. I take a more sort of pragmatic view, really. I think the tends to be a more brutal thing than that. The language, a lot of people would argue it was there already, English, but you don't know really, because languages come and go, but we have a different situation here with the technological oomph that English has got at the moment from the Americans particularly, but you don't know what will happen there. Certainly at the moment in the science and engineering world, computing, English is sort of pushed all before it, but nevertheless the other languages are very important indeed as well. So I just don't know what would happen there. Any other points? Right.
I would just say on that point that within the world of interlinguists, that is Esperantists, Swedists, Glossists and sort of interlingua, there's considerable debate about what are the best qualities for a language to adopt.
Yes.
One example is the accusative case,
Mm.
as in the object of the sentence. The Esperantists have it. The Edists have it in inverted word order only, and the others say no way we're going to have it.
Yes.
So I mean, those are the examples.
Yes, that's right. And I think that unfortunately, in any human activity, a large body of people prefer and enjoy the conflict more than the actual activity itself. And unfortunately, that's a human thing. Yeah. So, any other points?
I'd just like to say that I have a very similar experience to with insecurity, cultural insecurity from Australia.
Yes.
And I wonder if you have ideas about how to break that down, particularly when a language becomes a weakness, might become the Irish has started to become weak.
Yes. Well, I don't know whether you can break it down. I mean, all you can do is, and I mean this in quite a genuine sense, exorcise the ghosts by, well, it's not so sort of extreme in the case of Irish in many ways, although the language has got different histories. You can remedy the situation to a large extent just by recognising or trying to recognise in various views, because it's controversial, all this stuff, about what happened in the past. And the mere fact of studying the language does, in fact, satisfy a lot of people. Just the mere fact of learning a few words in many cases does give people a lot of enjoyment. And they essentially want to see what their traditional culture was. And in many cases that's sufficient. They don't want to take it any further. It just depends what you want to do.
But often it encourages a reaction. I found myself in a situation where quite a few English speakers and I started to speak Irish with them because there's a death silence concern and all that.
Yeah, I think that's partly because certainly in most parts of Britain and Ireland and the Isle of Man, so few people have heard any other language. I mean, excepting the Welsh-speaking areas now, and sort of pockets left of Irish, pockets left of Scots Gaelic. They don't hear any other languages. But possibly things have improved very, very slightly in that the tendency on television has been more and more to use subtitles rather than, as was done up till very recently, to completely blank out any other language and have a voiceover giving the English translation. But it is largely to do with that. I think Bernard Kane can again bear me out in this, because there was a famous incident historically in Liverpool where Bernard was set on by an irate Scouser who objected to us speaking Manx on the bus, and Bernard was asked to go home and he said, "Yes, I'm going home on Monday." That's what? Well, they are to a large extent. I mean, a key feature would be to be able to produce programs, television programs, which people took seriously. The problem is, you see, that the big guns have got all the money, the big media organisations. Channel 4 has been a great boost in this respect because they've helped a lot. But in general, obviously any commercial organisation will generally not be interested in minority interests as they see it. So the key is the media, actually. It is, very much so. But we'd have to produce, and this has been done with Welsh to a large extent, programs which were taken seriously, which were not so amateurish that people laughed at them.
In your Eldorado, as you say it,
Yeah.
you spot a spaceship carrying English-speaking immigrants approaching. Do you let it land?
Yes, you have to, I think. And you teach them Manx. No, you'll have to have a mix, you see, because they don't want to get into too dangerous ground here. But what we're seeing, certainly with the collapse of communism and the developments and the fighting in Yugoslavia and so on, you can interpret this in various ways. It's it's labelled as a sort of re-emergence of nationalisms, but of course they were there all the time, and what's happened has been essentially that the lid's been taken off. So I'm arguing here not for that extreme assertion of nationalism. In fact, in a way, I'm not arguing for nationalism at all, you could say, but for cultural activity which can be taken in different ways. And this, of course, is a waste of time, I know, with a lot of people who are not particularly interested in these activities. But it's nevertheless true that there is a great searching for identity and for roots. And I think this is part of the thing which is happening in England at the moment. Because England itself, I think, feels that it's lost its way. And there is this search in England itself, and there is, hopefully, a better recognition that inside these islands you have got other cultures which are still there. There may be fragments left of them in some cases, and strong remnants of them left in other cases. But the plea has to be that they're taken much more seriously, and there are at least some hopeful signs that this may be happening. But you'd have to let the spaceship land, yes. So I think I'd better wrap up there in case, yeah, yes.
Sort of looking forward to your job in the future, Max. I have a rather warm view that's a reinforcement. That you look around at the existing Manx people, those who succeeded and have worked in Manx today, that many of them could be claimed are perhaps a higher intelligence group, and have some innate facility for linguistic acquisition, which is called success to them, and they've kept on and they've done the hard slog of learning the grammar, they've succeeded, and I hope that this lecture won't reinforce the wrong impression.
Yeah, I've probably given the wrong impression. No, that's not true at all, you see, because, yeah, it's a warped view, and it's built as, yeah. Yes, that's right, yes. Yes, I agree. It's unfortunate to give that image. I didn't intend that at all, but it can well be taken that way, yes, yeah. But that's, yeah, yes, I agree that it's certainly not the image I've wanted to give. And you see, I can't really say anything on this, it's difficult to put this sort of in a nice way, but virtually all of my educational activities have shown me that there aren't any such distinctions at all. Certainly a case of physics, and certainly my experiences in trying to teach Irish at evening classes in Liverpool, where we've tried to cover as wide a range as possible, generally with a spoken language, that it is possible. I mean, this is true, and again in other cultures. It may be the sort of thing you meet, especially inside English cultures, as it were. There's no problem. There's no great problem at all over this, you see. Yes, that's right, yes. Yeah. Yes, I'm interested in the grammar and structure as well, but that's just the way it went. And if other people had if we could try and reproduce these sort of circumstances, which I think we could do, where people could have the opportunities to hear a lot of Manx spoken over extended periods, and then had the reinforcement afterwards, the crucial thing, they could pick the language up. So I think virtually anyone, within certain limits, can learn it. But it is true that I suppose once you get beyond a certain age, it may be more difficult. Yeah. Right. See.
I'm very grateful that I've been asked tonight to propose the vote of thanks to Brian. He, as he has intimated to you, is a friend of mine of very long standing, and we have had some very interesting contacts, conversations and experiences together in the past as a result of our mutual interest in the Manx language. One of which, of course, he's already alluded to, this incident where I was attacked on a bus. I must say, Brian was with me at the time. It was Brian I was speaking to. I was attacked on a bus by a drunken man who was accompanied by his little daughter. and I suspect she'd been sitting outside the pub all night waiting to bring him home, and she was very distressed and kept shouting, "Daddy, Daddy, stop us," as he was trying to dot me one, which he in fact did several times, and eventually, I'm afraid, I lost patience and I dotted him one back. And I remember when we got off the bus, Brian looked at this fellow who, I'm sad to say, had a bit of blood dripping down his nose, and said to me in very awed tones, "Doggood, eh? Did you give him one?" But that was, I think, the only really unpleasant incident that our mutual interest in Manx ever actually got us into. Brian has raised a great many interesting points, and it's hardly appropriate now for me to dwell on any of them, but I would commend to people, despite the fact that it refers to the Celtic languages in a chapter entitled The Diseases of Language, that book, The Loom of Language by Lancelot Hogman. It has in fact been a source of inspiration, not only to 3 or 4 of us here in this audience tonight, but to a great many people elsewhere. If you ever can get a hold of a copy, do so and read it. As Brian said, it was a great help to have, in our case, a pal with whom one could speak Manx on frequent occasions. We tried for a long time to avoid speaking English at all, and because our command of the language and the vocabulary was not very great at the time, we used to go to some very convoluted explanations and circumlocutions to do this. But I'm sure it was good for our linguistic growth, as it were. And I well remember too a visit that we paid together to Dublin, where we went to the Institute of Advanced Studies. We just sort of called in, and we were very pleased to see that there they managed to combine in one building a library of Irish books with another section which had a cyclotron in it. We were allowed to see the books, but they wouldn't let Brian at the cyclotron. I think he's probably made up for that since. But it certainly is possible to combine physics with languages in a very meaningful and fruitful way, which I think in his instance bodes well for the success of the post which he is about to undertake next year. Physicists are pragmatists, so I'm quite confident that Brian will concentrate on the essential part of language, which is communication. I think there's a tendency sometimes to become too obsessed with the minutiae of grammar, which can lead to a clouding of the fact that language is basically about communication between human beings, and has this remarkable power through its written form to allow us to communicate not only with our contemporaries, but also with people far in the past, and hopefully will enable us to leave something of value for those in the future. I have a personal view that the loss of language is as great a loss to the human spirit as the loss of an animal species is to the world of nature. I hope perhaps some of you share that view. Ach nish ligt au grey as lai ulion slide on show noch gur my moor Dutch one you there's an neden ram force as fis as the lotus nacht as the shinjiken roan the head and lid and force athad tret out chit the hovrige an alien Sylvain show chit
gur my moor one you.
Finally, may I just say that when Brian was a young lad and was writing to the papers, somebody wrote in reply that he thought that if Brian didn't give up Manx, he wouldn't get further than the Cholach. Well, Brian got a lot further than the Cholach, And I'm glad to say that having been head of physics
I'm coming back to the cello.
at a College of Advanced Technology, he is about to be promoted to the post of Manx Language Officer. Thank you very much.
Good to my